Okay, I think we should get started. I hope you can all hear me and see me. My name is Sofie Henriksen. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar today. This webinar is co-organized with my two colleagues, Marie Kolding and Sarah Siddiq. Maria is a senior researcher here at DIIS. She works on topics of debt, credit, digital finance, and gender inequality with a particular focus on Brazil. And Sarah is a PhD student here at DIIS, and she is currently finishing up her really interesting dissertation about data extractivism and data flows in femtech enterprises in Kenya. And before we get started, I just quickly want to mention, as you've probably also been notified, that this event is being recorded. And the recording will be available from DIIS's website after this event and also from DIIS's YouTube channel, as you can also see in the chat now. So this means that if you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your cameras when you speak. And also in general, keep your microphones off during the presentation. After the presentation, you'll have an option or the opportunity to ask questions to our speakers and also offer your comments. You can do that either by using the raise your hand function or by posting the questions in the chat, and we will make sure that they are seen there. Today's webinar is hosted by the DIIS Tech Initiative, and this initiative is an initiative at DIIS where researchers come together from various disciplinary backgrounds to examine technology and society and engage in conversation about emerging tech-related issues. And one of the ways that we do that is by fostering international collaboration and hosting public events. And this webinar is actually the third event in a series of public seminars that Sarah, Marie, and I have organized over the last couple of months. And you can see in the chat there are some links to the previous events if you want to read more. The seminar series has aimed to open up and discuss new perspectives on the links between data extraction and global inequalities from a non-technical perspective, because as we will also discuss today, technological developments have much wider implications for the social and economic orders that we all participate in. And so to help us continue this discussion, we have two brilliant speakers today, Nick Couldry and Ulises Mejias, and they will help us reflect on and understand how the massive data collection that we all experience in our daily lives is a new type of colonialism. So what links can we draw to historical forms of colonialism, and what kinds of resistance become available to us in this present form of colonialism? These are some of the questions that Nick and Ulises address in their recent work. And before I hand over to them, I just quickly want to introduce them individually. Nick Couldry, he is sociologist and professor of media, communications, and social theory at London School of Economics. His research centers on the power of media to define political and social realities. And for the past decade or so, Nick's work has increasingly shed light on the role of digital media in these power relations. He is the author and editor of no less than 15 books, and his work has been published in top journals such as Social Media and Society and Big Data and Society. Ulises Mejias is professor in the Communication Studies Department at the State University of New York. His research interests include critical data studies and the political economy of digital media, and he has written about these topics in 2 books, countless journal articles, and in op-eds published in international news outlets such as Al Jazeera. He is the recipient of the 2023 Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Scholarship from the State University of New York, and from 2021 to 2025, he is also serving as a Fulbright specialist. And as I hope that we will hear more about in their talk, both Nick and Ulises are also involved in different forms of activism related to resisting data colonialism and to proposing interventions for the decolonization of data. So very warm welcome to Ulises and Nick, and thank you very much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sophie, and thanks to you and to Marie and Sarah for this very kind invitation. We're delighted to accept it, to talk to you today. And in our talk, Ulises and I, we're going to draw on the book we published in 2019 called The Costs of Connection with Stanford University Press, which is now also out in Italian and Spanish and Turkish. But we're also going to draw for the first time on a new book called Data Grab, which will come out with Penguin in the UK, Chicago University Press in the US, and in a simultaneous German translation with Fisher, which will translate our academic argument for a general audience. And that should be out in February or March next year. So we'd like to start with 3 quotations that illustrate the core process that we're trying to understand in our work, which is a new land grab in the domain of data and AI. First of all, an important statement a decade ago by Google's chief economist, Hal Varian, in an academic paper that became very famous, where he said, there is now a computer in the middle of virtually every transaction. Because our transactions are now computer mediated, we can observe behavior. And when he says we, he means Google. We can observe behavior that was previously unobservable and write contracts on it. In other words, make money out of our observability. This fundamental principle, however, is not limited just to the obvious suspects, search engines and social media. It's transforming domains as distant from them as agriculture and food production. As a leading article on so-called ag tech brings out, the article by Alistair Fraser on precision agriculture, where he says very simply, the land grab yields a data grab. And this seizing of data lies, of course, at the core of the trend that's been dominating debates for the past year, generative AI. And it does this because, as we argue in our new book, all our collective cultural and social products are now just pipelines to ChatGPT, DALL-E, Bing Chat, Bard, and so on. They're pipelines which are supplemented by our own interactions with AI. To quote Ravit Dotan, an academic whom the Financial Times spoke to in August, once we interact with a chatbot, this really exposes much more of our data to the company. So there's something big and very broad going on with data and AI today. The question is, how can we understand this? The key question of our book is, what is going on with data? What is going on with AI behind all the details across our economy and society and in our daily lives? Now, most writers analyze this exclusively in terms of a new capitalism, a new stage of capitalism. For example, digital capitalism, informational capitalism, platform capitalism, most famously from Shoshana Zuboff, surveillance capitalism, and also data capitalism. All these perspectives make important points. But we want to ask in our work whether something potentially even larger is going on. Indeed, perhaps a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. Now, we get hints of this colonial setting from the business cliches of the past decade. We just want to recall the well-known Economist editorial from May 2017, which said that data is the new oil. So is this phrase just a harmless metaphor, or does it disguise a genuinely colonial process? And what exactly would a data colonialism mean?
So a central point of our argument is that the way we're using the word colonialism does not simply imply a metaphor. We use the word colonialism not allegorically, but to describe an emergent reality. And that reality, of course, is what we're calling data colonialism. This form of colonialism, we argue, prepares the ground for a new mode of capitalist production, which will come later and which we don't know exactly what it will look like. But we can think, for instance, how plantations in colonialism financed the emergence of factories in capitalism, in early industrial capitalism. So we expect a similar progression to unfold, although we don't know exactly what it will look like. We do know that this will happen while coexisting with the legacy of neocolonial violence, a legacy that targets, of course, historically at-risk populations in terms of race, in terms of class, gender, and also in terms of environmental destruction. We are suggesting that we are witnessing a potentially global transformation that plays out in both the global north and the global south. So the connections, geopolitical connections, are just as sophisticated as they were in the original historical colonialism. Now, I think a question that might come up early in our presentation is whether we're suggesting that we can expect to see the same level of physical violence that we saw in historic colonialism. And our answer is no, we're not making a one-to-one comparison, but we are saying that the impact of social change is going to be comparable. So at this point, I think it would help if I give you sort of our official definition of what data colonialism is. We say that it is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from human life for profit. So we're not saying all data is bad, and we're not saying analyzing data is in itself bad. We're specifically talking about this phenomenon of appropriating data from our lives continuously for profit. To understand this definition, I think it also makes sense to identify the difference between colonialism and coloniality, which is a concept developed by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. And just to summarize briefly what is obviously a complex argument, he said that even though colonialism is over, there are no more colonies per se. Of course, it depends on whether we ask the people of Puerto Rico or Palestine or American Samoa whether they feel that's the case. But even though colonialism is over, the legacy of colonialism continues to influence and shape our lives, perhaps in the way that we imagine racial relations or even the production of knowledge. So we're saying that there are differences between historical colonialism and data colonialism. There are differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, the scales, and the context. Colonialism in Mexico looked very different than colonialism in India, obviously. But we are saying also that there is one clear similarity between the two, and that is the historical function. The historical function of both kinds of colonialism is the same, and that function is to dispossess, to extract. The old colonialism monopolized and acquired land. The new colonialism is about grabbing us, our social life, through this medium of data. But how is this new social order being rationalized? One of the reasons this order is very effective is because the new rationalities to justify it, to explain it, are based on old rationalities. Whether these are economic or legal or technological, they have a deep colonial past. To explain this, let me sort of start with the concept of cheap nature. Now, in order to colonize the world, nature had to be framed by the colonizer as cheap. It was said to be abundant. It was said to be free, just there for the taking, yes? So from a judicial perspective, it was said to be ownerless. At least it didn't have civilized owners. So that's where we have the concept of terra nullius, which means no man's land. The colonizer could just arrive at a seemingly empty land and take it for himself. Following cheap nature, we have the concept of cheap labor. In colonialism, again, some humans, and this was mostly determined by their race, were meant to provide the necessary labor to transform nature into wealth. So exploitation and the abuse that followed in colonialism were framed basically as social progress, something that was good for the whole of humanity. So if we follow this progression, we go from cheap nature to cheap labor to now, of course, cheap data. And if you notice, cheap data has some of the same extractive rationalities that we saw with nature and labor. Cheap data is said to be abundant. It's said to be free, just there for the taking. It doesn't have an owner, at least in its aggregate form. You and I might produce it, but by the time it gets aggregated, it needs a special kind of knowledge and technology to be processed, just like colonial resources. So our only job is to generate it. And we are told again that this is progress. That's what progress looks like, that is good for all of humanity. So in this way, we begin to realize the extractive relations that connect various social spheres.
But of course, this is a controversial argument. You may well be quite skeptical. So let's be very direct and summarize what we see as the advantages of understanding what's going on with data and AI through the framework of colonialism and not just capitalism. And we see the advantages as of two main sorts, those of breadth and those of depth. Let's start with breadth. Understanding what's going on with data and AI in a colonial frame helps us understand it in a much longer time scale, in terms of the past 500 years, and not just the past 4 decades in which the internet has grown up. It means that we can see data as a new historically significant form of resource extraction comparable to historical colonialism that could be building the foundations for the next stage of capitalism, just as historical colonialism laid the foundations for capitalism itself that started 2 centuries later. And there's also an advantage in terms of scope, because thinking about data colonialism means that we're not just looking at social media, although that's obviously still important. We're also looking at the normalization of surveillance right across the workplace today. We're looking at the emergence of new types of economic extraction in the gig economy. We're looking at totally new domains of data extraction, such as ag tech, which we already mentioned, but there's also ed tech, education, health tech, and so on. And we're looking at much less fashionable areas of the corporate data economy, such as logistics, the data that's extracted from workers and things to make sure your package arrives on time. And we're even looking at internal corporate data. It's striking that in 2017, in its annual report, IBM, which is not one of the sexy big tech companies, but extracts a lot of data, said that 80% of the world's most valuable data is actually internal to corporations. But of course, what's internal to a corporation is now shifting. If you own a smart fridge, then the way you use milk every day is now internal corporate data to the manufacturer of that smart fridge. And it means finally looking directly at the inputs to AI as part of data colonialism. But there are also advantages of depth in thinking about what's going on with data and AI, because the colonial frame reminds us that economic disposition is not just a matter of the economy, it's about creating a new form of social order that helps the economy function. A new social order around data and AI that involves new forms of us being dependent on technologies and us being governed by technologies, always based around things that seem nice, such as convenience, customization and personalization, but also, of course, force of some sort, which always reinforces those older inequalities, as Ulises said, those inequalities of class, gender, and race. And a colonial frame also helps us see, which just thinking about capitalism definitely doesn't, at the deepest continuity of all with the historic colonialism. Because we would argue that big data and AI is the continuation not just of population surveillance, but also of the long-term attempt of the West to impose one single vision of rationality on the rest of the world for the benefit of the West. And we see the push towards AI as the clearest example yet of this. But let's also not forget another important continuity in terms of the environmental damage that's done by the new colonialism, just as was done by historical colonialism. We're thinking of the costs of the billions of servers that are necessary for developing generative AI, the water that's necessary to cool down those servers, the rare minerals involved in the batteries, in the servers, and every device that we have. There is, in other words, no extension of capitalism without continuation of colonialism. But in our books, we also emphasize that the new asset seizures, the new data grab that characterize our age, come with changes that deepen our understanding of capitalism too. So let's go back to the greatest theorist of capitalism, Karl Marx, who argued that capitalism depends on a new type of social relation, what he called commodified labor relations. Now, an issue with traditional Marxism is that today's emerging social order around data and AI can't be understood just through labor relations. And we know that's the case because data is being extracted from us when we just ask ChatGPT, oh, what is X or what is Y? Even though we know we're not working, we're on holiday. And it's extracted from us when we swap photos of a beautiful family meal, when we're definitely on holiday. We're definitely not working for anyone. So we need to understand data colonialism through a new type of social relation, which is data relations, which we define as ways of reproducing and reconfiguring social life for one purpose, which is to optimize the extraction of data from it for profit. And this actually enables us to update Marx's theory of capitalism in an interesting way. It enables us to think about data as fundamentally a form of abstraction. And here we draw on the Marxist theorist Moishe Postone, who argued that underlying Marx's theory of capitalism was the idea of abstraction, because it's abstraction that makes possible commodification, the selling of units on a market. And it's abstraction, therefore, that makes possible both the commodification of labor, which was the main way capitalism operates when Marx was writing, and today, the commodification potentially of data. With the result that ordinary life, my life, our life, all of our lives, becomes what Marx called a direct factor of capitalist production. Just like the seeds and the manure that suddenly became commodities on a market for farmers in the capitalization of agriculture. But now it's also our life itself that is that direct input to capitalism. Now, of course, this might seem like a rather complex theory because it is a double theory of colonialism and capitalism. But in another way, this is very, very simple. And we know it every day because every time we download an app, every time we start using a new platform or plug in a new smart device in our home or just chat with ChatGPT, every time we do that, we fall back into the spiral of data relations. And this leads to a crucial point to which Ulises has already alluded, but it's so important that I'll make this point again. Normally, of course, none of this involves violence or physical force. So you might well be asking and puzzling, how can this then be colonialism? But here we have to remember that at the start of historical colonialism, there were no pre-existing social relations between the colonizers and the colonized. And that meant that to grab the gold, there were only two options: brutal physical violence and deception. But now, this new stage of colonialism, if we're right, benefits from the history of 2 or 3 centuries of capitalist social relations. It benefits from our habits of doing exactly what capitalism needs us to do for capitalism to function. And that means that just a small change in the legal terms that govern the operation of our phones can profoundly change our relations to our lives.
So to give an example of this coloniality of data relations that Nick was just describing, I would like to do a sort of transhistorical comparison, taking a look at 2 historical documents, one from the past, one from the present, to see the relationship between them. And so I would like to start with Google's terms of service statement for their Chrome browser. Now, in case you, like most of us, haven't read those terms of service, here is in part what they say. Sorry. When you install Chrome, you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. In other words, when we install Google Chrome, we're giving Google permission to access all of these things. Now, I would like to compare that to a much older document, a document that was called the requerimiento, which would translate from the Spanish as something like the requirement or the demand. This is a document that was read by Spanish conquistadors as they were about to enter a village or a city to colonize it. Sometimes they would stand outside of the city limits in cover of darkness and proceed to read this document in Spanish to a population that obviously did not speak Spanish. So that was kind of interesting. The document said, in part, "But if you do not submit to Spanish rule, that is, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as your highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods, and we shall do all the mischief and damage that we can." That's the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. I suppose we could click accept and install in that button. The point really here is not to suggest that what followed the reading of the Requerimiento is the same as what follows after we install Google Chrome. But basically, we do want to highlight or call attention to the use of this misleading and abstract language that we don't understand to conduct this initial trick of dispossession, of extraction. Now, we've mentioned violence a number of times, and this is an important way to examine the coloniality of these data relations through this issue of violence, to the question of whether the violence in data colonialism takes the same shape or perhaps different shapes than it did in historic colonialism. Now, of course, we know that physical violence still exists, of course. Hundreds of examples have already been documented, including systems that have produced racist results when it comes to determining access to services in healthcare, in housing, in education, personal finance, or when we look at online business practices that rely on the abuse of women or gender nonconforming individuals, or when biased algorithms are used in predictive policing, and so on. The impact of these systems is very real and is very physical, sometimes resulting in the loss of privacy, the loss of opportunity, the loss of dignity, in some cases, the loss of life. for members of these at-risk populations that have always been targeted in colonialism. But there is also another kind of violence that is perhaps less physical, perhaps more symbolic. And this kind of violence has always sought to colonize not just bodies, but ways of thinking as well. Which is why I have the picture here of the self-service kiosk. The kiosk doesn't really represent physical violence, unless we think perhaps of the violence of replacing a human worker with a machine. But what it represents is a new way of doing things that replaces and eliminates previous ways of life. So once we get used to the self-service kiosk, we forget that there was ever an alternative way of doing things. And of course, data extraction plays a larger role in this new way of doing things. So it is in this way that I mean that our minds are colonized by this symbolic violence. And of course, there is one more kind of violence, which we have alluded to, environmental violence. Digital technologies are often presented as green technologies, but we know that this is not always the case. Just to give you an idea of the costs, it is calculated that making 5 to 50 ChatGPT queries, depending on where servers are located, consumes about 500 milliliters of water. Some people are now talking about a coming green colonialism and predicting that producing microchips sustainably or cooling more and more data centers or meeting the emerging demand for batteries simply shifts the consumption of resources, right? We've shifted from coal and oil to now lithium, coltan, or fresh water. So at this point, you might be feeling a little overwhelmed. If we have not been able to eradicate the legacy of colonialism in 500 years, what are the chances we will be able to do so now? So we would like to close with some thoughts on how we can decolonize data. Since data colonialism is a complex problem, it does require multifaceted and complex solutions, which means we have to act simultaneously across 3 different spheres: within the system, against the system, and beyond the system. Acting only in one area is not going to be enough. It's not going to be effective. So we need to engage in all 3. What does it mean to act within the system? So as boring and frustrating as it might sound, this means participating in mainstream politics, elections, referendums, and so on. We must continue to push governments to recognize our rights. We must continue to define agendas and elect politicians who commit to implementing these agendas. So no, not every campaign is going to be a win for us, but we must keep applying pressure. This also means demanding more regulation, pushing for antitrust regulation, for new forms of ex-ante and ex-post regulation that takes into account the impact of technologies before and after they are released. And here it is also important to recognize the role of internal corporate dissent, which we're seeing more of these days. Whistleblowers or tech workers who speak against the actions of their own companies. That is also something very important. So these are ways of trying to change the system from within. But of course, it is never going to be enough to do that. So sometimes we will have to decolonize data by working directly against the system. This means engaging in politics of resistance. And here we can learn a lot from past and present decolonial movements. While avoiding, of course, appropriation, we can certainly learn from these struggles and try to do the hard work of building solidarity with all peoples engaged in decolonizing data. Some movements have learned to use strategies, for instance, of boycott, divestment, sanctions quite effectively, even if the US and Israel have tried to make such tactics illegal or heavily penalized. Others have engaged in creative forms of protest, such as the group Deliberistas Unidos, which you see in the background picture here. These are mostly a group from Latin American immigrants in New York who organized successfully to demand better working conditions. Of course, whether we work within or against the system means that in some ways we're still defining ourselves in relation to the system. So decolonizing data will also require that we learn to think entirely beyond the system, to liberate our colonized minds. And this involves, of course, the politics of non-alignment. We could reject data colonialism by creatively finding ways of reclaiming colonized space and time, the time we spend in front of screens, the space colonized by surveillance devices. We also can work beyond the system by using alternative technologies. A lot of this already exists, but of course the problem is that using different technologies means living different lives, and we are increasingly finding it difficult to do that. Which is also why I think a radical re-education and redesign are crucial. I think we're not doing a good enough job of educating the future engineers, the scientists, the business leaders who are shaping this extractivist system. So we must do a better job of doing that. The good news is that working within, against, and beyond the system requires a tool we already have, and that tool is imagination. When colonialism couldn't be resisted with the body, it could be resisted with the mind. So just to sum up, we think decolonizing data and rejecting data colonialism will above all be a cultural movement, and a movement we can all participate in by giving free rein to our creativity. With this, I think we will stop and do Q&A. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for this insightful presentation. I have the pleasure to facilitate the Q&A now and would like to invite the audience to think about questions now, either raising their hand online or writing them into the meeting chat. In the meantime, to give you some time to think about or formulating these questions, I would like to pose a question to you two. You demonstrated that these processes play out in both the global south and the global north. What I have been wondering or been curious about, if you see any specific processes when looking outside of this north-south dichotomy, but perhaps also in south-south context or north-north contexts. Perhaps
You're
also
muted, Nick, but why don't you go first?
That's a complex question, that one. Well, just as with historical colonialism, there are, of course, if in our today's terms, north-north relations, the battles between Spain and Portugal, then Holland and Britain, and then between most of Europe and the US. Those were certainly important. So today we have a battle between the US and China. In a short presentation, we didn't have time to say much about China, but the way we draft our definition in our book, where we have more space, is to allow that the value that's extracted from data and AI is not always economic value. It can also be the sorts of social value that all-powerful government like the Chinese government wants to extract from society to impose a different type of social order. And again, we think that's a virtue of the flexibility of our model, that it's not just about taking stuff from Western social media platforms or the Western search engines, which is the way Zuboff explains what surveillance capitalism is. It's a totally new way of thinking about the order of society, an extractive way of thinking about it at every level. And China is just as much an example of that as the US is. So that's the north. But perhaps, Ulises, you want to talk about the south-south. You probably may have a better response to me on that.
Yeah, well, I think what I would say is that embedded in the nature of capitalism was always the idea of, I guess, what we commonly refer to as divide and conquer. The idea that by setting up conflicts in the colonies, between different ethnicities or between different colonies that ultimately benefited the colonial order as well. So I do think we see that replicated in data colonialism a bit, in the sense not only, as Nick mentioned, that the global south is being divided parceled out between the United States and China, but also specific characteristics of nations in the global south play an important role in how they are presented as part of this new world order. So, for instance, if the country of Chile has a lot of copper mines or lithium, but other countries have different kinds of minerals or populations that can be integrated into the system, these differences are exploited, so to speak, to also put these countries in competition with each other so that the overall order of colonialism can keep progressing as well.
Thank you. I'm very happy that you brought the topic of value up, Nick, because that would have been my second question. And perhaps that could be interesting to also think about in terms of the next question that we have in the chat from Jill, which is how does your usage of colonialization here overlaps with platform imperialism, for example, in the US-dominated market? Is that some?
I think you're muted again.
I'm being too careful. Do you want to start on that one, Ulises, or?
Sure. Well, I think, as we try to argue also, we do see data colonialism as a global social order dominated by two poles of power, and that is the United States and China as well. So if we think about the platforms that each one of them sort of have exported, I think, an interesting comparison is to think about how in 1945, 1 in 3 people in the world were living under some sort of colonial rule. Today, 1 in 2 people in the world use a meta product, where it's Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp. So the scale of this platform imperialism, as the person in the chat is pointing out, I think is something that continues to boggle the mind and shape geopolitics in very specific ways. So, but I think that's the point that we would make, that it's no longer just the United States exporting these technologies. I think, as we can see, China is playing an increasingly important role, especially when it comes to the global south. China is doing a very active dissemination of its technologies and its platforms, obviously to the rest of Asia, but to Africa and Latin America as well.
And perhaps I could add another point about the word imperialism. Imperialism, as we understand it, Ulises and I, was the more advanced organizational stage of colonialism, which evolved really over 2 or 3 centuries to build really mature bureaucracies in the British Empire, then the American Empire, and the Dutch, and so on. And the core point of our argument is that we're not trying to compare what's happening today with what happened 3 centuries on into historical colonialism, because that would make no sense. It took 3 centuries to evolve that mature imperialism. We're comparing what's happening with data today to the beginnings of historical colonialism, when there was a lot of confusion about what that would mean socially, whether it was even legitimate, and so on. Imperialism did not yet exist, but colonialism, the grabbing of the assets, did. That was what motivated everything else. So we certainly recognize the force of the arguments by David Niebert and others about platform imperialism. The particular argument is about what's going on in Canada in relation to the US. And that, of course, does continue because, as we emphasize, historical colonialism hasn't disappeared. Our global economy is still profoundly unequal because of historical colonialism. But the new data grab is happening everywhere and has not yet fully evolved its institutions. I think we're seeing with the normalization of AI in everyday life the very beginnings of institutional formation, but we don't try and predict how that's going to play out over the next 100 years. So that's the sort of language point I'm making in relation to Gil, but it's a good question.
Thank you for clarifying that. I'd like to give the word to Marie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. So I wanted to return to the question around the global south and to think about how to apply theory of data colonialism to, so not when we talk of what's going on between countries, but within countries. And I'm asking this because of, I'm trying to think through data colonialism in relation to my own work in Brazil, looking at the ways that the banking sector and the fintech sector is using and commodifying data. And so these are, Brazilian companies, many of them, or maybe from some of them from other, that originated from other countries in the region. But if we stick to the Brazilian companies working with big data to collect data on the Brazilian population, right? So then how are we to understand the data colonialism practice in that context with, national actors, acting this out?
Yeah. Well, as you're bringing out, Marie, of course, once we start to think within this larger colonial frame, we gradually bring in all the complexities of actual historical colonialism, and they are beginning to play out in relation to data. So first of all, as various writers point out, there was always an internal colonialism. There was always an elite that benefited more from the relations to the colonial powers in Argentina, in Chile, and in African countries, and so on. So internal colonialism is definitely a possibility. But then it's important to underline, and this relates to a work I did with a Brazilian writer, João Magalhães, on the welfare systems in Latin America in the past few decades. They're increasingly moving to AI extraction as a way of managing the welfare system in underfunded states such as Brazil and Argentina. But of course, they're doing it off the back of American big tech, particularly Microsoft, which provides the basic tools to do this. So you can see that internal colonialism is part of the bigger picture of the global expansion of a new type of colonialism, which is data colonialism, which is so new that we almost don't see it happening. It's just justified in terms of using scarce resources to maintain what exists, the welfare system, but actually it's using radically different means, which are the tools of data colonialism. So that would be my answer on that one.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that in many cases, states and governments in the global south, and I noticed this next question in the chat is about states and actors, but in a lot of cases, these states don't have the capacity to do these things on their own. So of course they have to partner with these global corporations. I mean, another example of what Nick was just talking about is, for instance, the Argentinian government working in collaboration with Microsoft to come up with an AI model that can predict 5 to 6 years in advance teenage girls from lower economic strata who will become pregnant. So this kind of modeling, this kind of analysis can only be done with the infrastructure provided by big tech corporations. So these kinds of relationships are very interesting, even within internally to the global south.
Right. So you would point to the way that local actors are still connected to these global, global structures and big tech companies and technologies, etc. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a small question in between now that we're talking about the welfare and we're talking about the example that you just brought up about the prediction of teenage pregnancies. I myself work in the context of Kenya with reproductive technologies that also employ AI technologies or other forms of data flows. And you mentioned earlier that our bodies might be the ones that produce it, but we don't necessarily own it because we're not the aggregators. Can you be a little bit more explicit about the role of us or the role of the people that generate the data in these contexts?
Do you want to start, Ulises, or?
You can go ahead and I'll add.
Okay, well, the first thing I'd point out is to emphasize the way we use the word order in our argument. And here's another big difference between our argument and Shoshana Zuboff's. Zuboff basically understands surveillance capitalism as a form of force, a coup from above, she calls it, which is imposed from on top onto the rest of us, forcing us to do things we really don't want to do. And there's something to that, of course, sometimes. But we think that misses the bigger point that all of us are involved in making possible this new form of social order. Just as happened with the colonial order, it involved, to some degree, the cooperation of the colonized, learning new ways of behaving, new ways of dressing, new forms of organizing life, new forms of organizing the economy. So order is a much more powerful way of understanding how all of us are involved in this, and that of course involves the body. So if again we take the case of ChatGPT, if you look, for example, at dating apps, and I know a colleague who's specialist on dating apps and how they're using AI. Now it's now quite common, it was announced a few weeks ago, that one of the main dating apps is saying, well, just give us all your pictures and we'll use AI to pick the one that shows you as most attractive. And then you can trust us, and then you're more likely to have success in your dating. So there you've got us participating in an order which depends on an external machine, which makes decisions through means we don't understand to make us do something all of us wants to do, which is to look nicer. So this is a very vivid example through AI of how we're all part of this order, which of course installs an infrastructure, and the infrastructure has power relations, as even the advocates of AI like Mustafa Suleyman emphasize.
Yeah, I think the question of complicity is a very important one, which we didn't get to discuss too much during the presentation, but that's a key difference. I think earlier forms of colonialism, people didn't really have an option. They were coerced into the system. Later, they sort of, found, as Nick is suggesting, ways of participating in it. Supposedly, today, we are not coerced. It's our decision to participate or not participate. But of course, we can talk about, notions of consent. And as we discussed during the requerimiento part of the presentation, do we really understand the terms of use? Do we really understand what we are consenting or agreeing to? Some people also have suggested models for paying us for the individual data that we produce as a solution to this problem. It's like, well, to end the extractivism, let's just pay people for the data that they produce. And while that's an interesting solution, we don't think that really addresses the problem, because firstly, it sort of individualizes it so that it seems like, if I get paid individually for my data, then there's no problem. It sort of erases the social nature of this problem. And secondly, it doesn't end the extractivism. It would just be a way to sanction it. So I think we need to, that's where imagination is crucial. We need to keep questioning and rethinking our individual and our collective roles in the systems.
Thank you. I mean, we briefly talked about Henrik's question in the meeting chat, but if you have anything to add to the question, then that would be the possibility. And afterwards, I would hand over the word to Sophie.
Do you want to answer Henrik's question?
Well, sure. I'll just say briefly that, of course, colonialism was always a partnership between states and corporations. So going back, hundreds of years, we already see this sophisticated and rich collaborations going on. Of course, the prime example of a corporation, colonial corporation, is the East India Company. But even going back to Spanish colonialism, they had institutions such as the Casa de la Contratación de las Indias, which were prototypical corporations that got permission from the state to conduct colonial activities. So the role of the state was also very important in legitimizing, in providing the legal framework. And of course, back then, we also had the role of the church to provide the spiritual justification for doing all of these things. That's no longer the case, of course, although we do have new ways of sublime narratives about convenience, about community, that in some ways also legitimize what corporations and states do with our data.
Sophie?
Yeah, thank you both so much for this really interesting presentation. My question is more about this global transformation that you talk about, and what I find really interesting about your work is that, and quite different from other accounts of digital capitalism or data capitalism, is that it seems like you are kind of starting at a different place on the timeline, and you mentioned that it's an emerging order and it's just getting started, and to me that's both kind of encouraging because we can still maybe do something to change this course of action, but it also makes me think I almost can't possibly imagine how much more pervasive data extractivism can get. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on, well, where is this taking us? If it's only just getting started, where are we going with this unless we can find ways to resist?
That's a really great question, because you've got to the core of why we tried to tell the story the way we did, which was to get beyond the idea that we already knew what was happening. Because it's quite clear, if you go back 500 years, the conquistadors, they had no idea the significance of what they were doing. How could they? And the Spanish court spent decades debating whether it was right or wrong to enslave the bodies of potential Christians, whether that was deeply immoral. In the end, they decided it was absolutely fine. There was a lot of money at stake after all. So the uncertainty was very much part of the original colonialism, and it does characterize the world today. So if we think of the ambiguity around what's going on with AI, is it the greatest opportunity of humanity ever to finally be in control of its destiny, or is it the greatest existential threat? Well, this existential worry is being played out in boardrooms all across the world for various reasons. But as you say, the key is, how could this develop? And that's again where China comes in. We saw in the pandemic what the beginnings of a fully datafied society would look like, where in what was already an authoritarian society, of course, but an extremely complex one with obvious limits to the state's traditional power, the state suddenly, through apps, through the fact that everyone necessarily carries a phone, and necessarily has that phone switched on with the COVID app on it. And I talked to many students who experienced this. It literally was not possible to leave their apartment without having the right designation in terms of COVID health. And this was profoundly oppressive, unimaginably bad. And I don't know about you in Denmark, but certainly the Chinese students who've been coming to the UK in the past 2 or 3 years talk very vividly about this. So we do have some sort of sense. And of course, then you get the American government will say, well, of course, we're exactly not like China. And there have been many statements from Joe Biden and others saying that's the bad way to do this. Let's do it a better way. But our argument is that the difference is not quite so obvious. That if you're building seriously a social order, which let's say will mean that every time we want to know something, we don't ask the person sitting next to us, we talk into a device, we tap into a device, that could have profound consequences in terms of how we think about ourselves in relation to power. And I think that AI, if you like, is the step beyond the data colonialism we saw 5 years ago and starts to see quite how deep and interlocking this new order is. So we're still at the beginning of it, but I think the warning signs are already starting to be there.
Yeah, just in terms also, if we want to really get dystopian about it, I think it's concerning to see what's happening in terms of brain implants, which some big tech companies and some billionaires are very interested in. In other words, no longer using the phone or the laptop as a mediating device, but having a direct connection to our biology through our brain that connects us to the internet. That's one big area of concern. The other one for me is also emotion surveillance, which is already happening. It's not only just about capturing attention when we go online, but also about measuring and capturing our emotional states through cameras, through microphones, etc., and making predictions about it. So to predict whether I'm going to be happy or sad on a Friday night in order to perhaps reach me with different kinds of advertisements accordingly. So I think it seems like data extraction cannot get worse, but unfortunately, I think there's plenty of room for expansion.
Marie, we have time for one more question.
Well, so maybe, well, get us on a more positive note, because that was very disturbing and release this. Well, both of you, right, reminding us that it probably can indeed get worse. But you ended your presentation on a more hopeful note, talking about cultural movement that then might come, emerge as a response to all this. But then I was thinking, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this, because if we're all being dispossessed of all kinds of data, but some of these extractive processes, they're happening without us really noticing. We don't necessarily feel it. We don't really know what our data, how it's being extracted, what it's being used for. And so I'm wondering, how are people going to rebel? Because we aren't necessarily feeling that pain yet, at least, right? And that is perhaps something that will be more felt in the future. But right now, yeah, there's just so many extractive processes, of which many of them are happening in a very subtle manner.
Ulises, do you want to
Why
talk?
don't you start on that one?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll allow. I will. Yes. Let me stay with the negative just for 1 second, because there's a point that, again, in half an hour we couldn't get across in our book, but we do think is really important, which is that we are here fundamentally talking about freedom, the very possibility of freedom. And in our first book, we have a chapter which goes back to Hegel's definition of freedom, perhaps the most radical that's ever been imagined, which is the freedom to be with oneself in the other. It's radical because it's a social definition of freedom, so it recognizes the other, relationality, but it says the freedom to be with oneself, in the German bei selbst, alongside oneself. And unfortunately, it's exactly that is being threatened by things like external emotional intelligence and so on. So, or indeed ChatGPT, which really changes out the way we think about what it is to know the world. Can human beings know the world, or is knowledge now property only of external systems? You don't need to be a philosopher to realize that could have quite big impacts on our self-identity, and therefore on the very meaning of freedom. Why did we even desire freedom in the first place? So I think the risks are really serious, but as Ulises said, we think imagination is the only way of beginning, just as it was in other fundamental human struggles. And that's why we decided at the beginning of the pandemic to create with our great Mexican colleague, Paula Ricaute, to build a network called Tierra Común. And maybe I can try and put, or maybe, let me see if I can just get that into the address into the chat. Yes, there we are. It's a trilingual website, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, which brings together activists and academics who are concerned to pool their imagination to resist data colonialism. Clearly, this is something too big for any of us to resist on our own. And I'll end my optimistic point with saying none of us, I think, if we're honest, knows what the alternative to capitalism is yet. There have been failed attempts to change capitalism. But we did see the end of certain aspects of colonialism in history in the 60s and 70s. There were successful anti-colonial movements. They didn't, of course, change certain fundamental aspects of the global economy and racism, but they had some very significant success. So thinking about the colonial aspects of this means that we have turned the unimaginability of capitalism into something that we can at least know what it is to imagine, to say no to. And that's what we believe we need to start doing.
Yes, I think, the work we do with networks such as Tierra Común. I'm also involved in another one, the non-aligned technologies movement, which sort of takes I'll post the link in a little bit, learning from history, from the time during the Cold War, when a lot of global South nations said, we don't want either option, capitalism or communism. We must be able to define our third option, an option for ourselves. Since then, we've had this notion of non-alignment, and so we're trying to imagine what that would look like in terms of technologies and their infrastructures. I think there's plenty of room for optimism, even while remaining critical. I think, I like to quote Gramsci's notion of pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. I think it is important to remain critical and to be a little bit comfortable with the tragedy of what's going on, because I think to think of easy solutions and ways of feeling good about what's happening will not really get us out of this problem. So I think being open to this kind of criticism and pessimism is important. But I do see signs for measured optimism. Just anecdotally, I teach about these things, obviously. And I think 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, most of my students would say, why does this matter? Why should I care if my data is being captured? I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not a terrorist. So what if the state or corporations are monitoring what I do? That has started to shift. And I think students more and more are asking questions and are realizing this is not okay. Yes, some students still feel that there's no immediate danger to them if their data is being extracted, but more and more students are starting to ask questions and realize that perhaps this is not the kind of construction of the social that they see as that they want. So I do think in that sense, social change is slow, but it does tend towards notions of justice and solidarity. So I'm hopeful about that.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation, for discussing our questions with us. I think that was a really nice way to end on an outlook. I would like to give the word to Marie for a quick wrap up before we finish this webinar. But yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, I just want to echo that. It's great to end off on this note on staying optimistic while remaining critical, and yeah, stay with this vision that there is room for transformation, and that transformation is already happening. But yeah, thank you for sharing your really powerful ideas with us today. Thank you to the audience. So in this seminar series, we've been discussing the various interplays between datafication and capitalism and inequality, and the data colonialism thesis really foregrounds the continuities of current datafication practices with historic forms of inequality. So we were really thrilled when you accepted our invitation to talk, because we really wanted to learn more about this decolonial turn. And I mean, your work offers such a comprehensive perspective on contemporary developments of data and technology, and reminds us that capitalism can best be understood through the lens of, or should be understood through the lens of colonial relations. And insisting on this long-term historical lens of extractivism. It's, for me at least, been a really valuable insight into understanding these current data practices, which then in turn, as I've learned, has implications for how we understand contemporary capitalism, which is definitely a new dimension that was brought into the discussion in this series. And yeah, so because you're proposing that we're not merely living in a time of data capitalism or digital capitalism or platform capitalism or surveillance capitalism, just to mention some of the current and exciting concepts to understand contemporary capitalism, but you're saying that there's something even bigger at stake, right? We're living a new stage of colonialism that is informing a new stage of capitalism, but from what I gathered, that new stage is still emerging and thus has not been named yet. So I really look forward to continuing following your work and hopefully then learn more about this capitalism in the making, and also to read your new book. That's really exciting that you have made this effort to turn all this powerful knowledge into a more publicly accessible book. So I look forward to reading it, and through that as well also learn more about how we can take action and stay optimistic and better preserve our data and social lives in the future. And also think this dimension that you are bringing out about the environmental costs of this expanding use of data and AI was definitely also a perspective that I haven't actually been including in my work yet. So thank you also for I mean, you're bringing of a lot of issues here, but that was just an example of one more aspect that I hadn't been contemplating. So thank you so much.
And a little bit of advertising. This is the book that you can buy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're very
Thank you
pleased
for
to
your
get the
invitation.
invitation.